Donald Trump just spent 2 days in Beijing telling the world he had made America strong again. At the exact same moment, Canadians were paying $1.90 per liter at the pump, a number that has been climbing every week since February because of a war his administration started. And the arms deal meant to deter China from moving on. Taiwan was quietly placed on hold, pending a conversation with the very government it was designed to deter. Hold both of those facts in your head at the same time, because the story coming out of Beijing is not the one being told on either side of the border. And for Canada, the details buried inside it matter in ways that Ottawa has not yet said out loud. Here is where I want to start. Not with the trade numbers, not with the Boeing announcement. I want to start on Air Force One, somewhere over the Pacific on the 15th of May, 2026. A reporter asked the President of the United States a direct question about Taiwan. Specifically, President Xi has warned that mishandling Taiwan could cause conflict between the U.S. and China. What is your response? And Donald Trump begins answering a question about the Strait of Hormuz. He references Iran. He references oil. He references a waterway on the other side of the planet. The reporter corrects him. Taiwan, Mr. President. Trump pivots, says he does not think there will be conflict, says Xi does not want to see a war, says he made no commitment either way. That moment, a president confusing two of the most geopolitically loaded words in American foreign policy inside a single press conference, got about 48 hours of coverage before the news cycle moved on. I want to suggest to you that it is actually the most clarifying thing that happened this entire week. Not because it tells you about the president's cognitive state. That is not an assessment any of us are qualified to make, and it is not what this channel does, but because of what it reveals about the structure of the meeting itself. When the most consequential bilateral summit of the year produces a press conference where Taiwan and Iran are interchangeable in the same answer, it tells you something about how much genuine strategic architecture was actually built inside those 2 days in Beijing. Let me give you the factual record. Trump and Xi met on the 14th and 15th of May at Tiananmen and Zhongnanhai. No binding agreements were signed. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, not a partisan institution, described the visit as, and I am characterizing here because EDSA requires it, a modest step towards stability in the world's most important bilateral relationship. NBC News went with no clear breakthroughs. Trump called it fantastic. The official Chinese readout used the phrase important consensus on maintaining stability. In diplomatic language, important consensus on maintaining stability is what you say when two sides agreed to keep talking. It is not a deal. It is a process. Here is what the coverage has largely missed. There are actually 3 separate stories inside this summit, and they operate on 3 completely different timelines. The first is the trade story, which is messy and unresolved. The second is the Taiwan story, which is the one that actually moved this week and which directly implicates Canadian interests in ways I will get to. The third is what I am calling the precedent story, and that one has a CUSMA review on July 1st written all over it. Let me take them in order, because by the time I am done with the third one, I think your read on this summit will look substantially different than it does right now. Start with trade. Trump announced a Boeing deal. Approximately 200 aircraft with a potential upside of 750 planes, quote, if they do a good job, 400 to 450 GE jet engines, an agricultural agreement described in general terms. Here's what you need to know about those numbers. As of the 15th of May, neither Boeing nor the Chinese government had formally confirmed the figures Trump announced aboard Air Force One. The Hill reported this. NBC confirmed it. That is not nothing. A deal that has not been confirmed by both parties is, in the language of international commerce, a statement of intent, not a contract. The original expectation coming into the summit, according to reporting from Bloomberg and Reuters going back to August of last year, was a potential order of up to 500 aircraft. Trump came out with 200 confirmed and 750 conditional. Whether that is a win or a miss depends almost entirely on the baseline you choose. And the baseline is contested. But here is where the story gets more complicated than the headline. Tariffs. Trump did not discuss tariffs with Xi. He confirmed this himself aboard Air Force One when pressed by a reporter. He said, And I am paraphrasing closely here to stay within attribution rules. They are paying tariffs, substantial tariffs, but we did not discuss it. That is the man whose entire economic identity is built around tariffs, meeting the country he has imposed the heaviest tariffs on for 2 days and not raising the subject. Analysts at CSIS note that China felt confident enough entering this summit to hold firm on multiple issues, including technology controls and sanctions. The tariff silence may be a strategic choice on Trump's part, or it may reflect the limits of what was actually achievable. What it is not is a resolution. And for Canadian exporters watching the U.S.-China trade relationship as a bellwether for how Washington approaches trade commitments generally, an unresolved tariff picture is not reassuring. But that is still not the most important thing that happened this week. Keep reading. The Taiwan story. This is the one I need you to pay close attention to. There is a $14 billion arms package sitting on a desk in Washington. It has been sitting there for months. It includes missile systems and drones. It was assembled by the Trump administration, an arms package, incidentally, that according to CNN exceeds in value the total of all arms sales made to Taiwan under the previous administration. And as of the 15th of May, Trump said he would make a determination on it within, quote, a fairly short period after speaking to, quote, the person that's running Taiwan. He declined to name the person. He declined to give a timeline. And he confirmed that he had discussed the arms sale directly with Xi Jinping during the summit. Let me translate what that means in policy terms, because this is important. Under a framework that goes back to 1982, specifically the Reagan-era assurances, the United States committed to not consulting China on arms sales to Taiwan. The principle was that Taiwan's security arrangements were not subject to Beijing's approval or input. Trump, when pressed on this by a reporter who cited the 1982 commitment, specifically said, and I'm quoting closely here because the exact language matters, 1982 is a long way. I'm going to consult with China. We discussed arms sales in great detail. That is not a small thing. Constitutional and foreign policy scholars will debate whether this technically violates the Reagan assurances or merely departs from their spirit. Taiwan's foreign ministry issued a statement the same day, thanking the U.S. for past support and reminding Washington of its legal obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act, the act that requires the U.S. to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself. The fact that Taipei felt it necessary to issue that reminder the same evening as the summit should tell you something about how Taipei read the room. One reading of what happened, and I want to be clear, this is analysis, not established fact, is that the arms package became, in Trump's own words, a very good negotiating chip. That is a direct quote. He described the $14 billion commitment to a Democratic ally as a chip to be played. Political observers across the spectrum have noted that this framing is a significant departure from how U.S. security commitments have traditionally been presented. The pushback, and it is worth sitting with, is that Trump's team would frame this differently. The OAN read, which reflects the White House's preferred narrative, is that this is a strategic pause, not an abandonment, that Trump is leveraging the delay to extract economic commitments from Beijing, and that the last thing the U.S. needs right now is a war 9,500 miles away, which is a direct quote from Trump himself aboard Air Force One. That argument has internal logic. Strategic ambiguity around Taiwan is not new. The question is whether there is a difference between calculated ambiguity and an arms commitment being actively used as a bargaining variable. And the answer to that question will likely determine the long-term trajectory of Indo-Pacific security architecture. But here is the thing that the Taiwan coverage almost entirely missed. And this is where Canada enters the frame. When Trump was asked about the 1982 Reagan commitments, he did not just dismiss the specific commitment on Taiwan arms sales. He articulated a governing principle. He said, "What am I going to do? Say I do not want to talk to you about something because of an agreement that was signed in 1982. His answer, in substance, was, prior commitments signed by prior administrations are not binding constraints on his decisions. He will consult with whomever he judges useful, regardless of what previous administrations agreed not to do. Now hold that principle up against the CUSMA review. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, has its first mandatory joint review on July 1st, 2026, 6 years after entry into force. The review is not a formal renegotiation, but as PwC's Canadian tax analysis team noted in April, it provides an opportunity to influence how the agreement is administered and enforced, including whether targeted changes or commitments are pursued. Patrick LeBlond, a trade policy scholar, told CBC that the Trump administration ultimately cannot be trusted to honor existing deals, noting that even existing deals are not being respected. Canada's former chief NAFTA negotiator, writing in Policy magazine, described the current environment as one where Washington expects Canada and Mexico to make concessions while the U.S. makes none. Those assessments were made before Beijing. Before a president stood on Air Force One and explained in plain language that 1982 commitments are not binding because they are old. CUSMA was signed in 2020. It was renegotiated during Trump's first term. By his own logic, commitments signed by prior administrations carry limited obligation. CUSMA is not immune to the same reasoning. Trump called CUSMA transitional during his meeting with Prime Minister Carney at the White House. He said it may have served its purpose. The Walrus, in a piece published on May 4th, argued that Canada should be prepared to walk away from the review rather than accept economic subordination, and that Trump's unstable economy actually weakens his negotiating hand. That is a contrarian but defensible read. The C.D. Howe Institute and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute have both argued that Canada should engage constructively but not rush, given that USTR Jameson Greer himself acknowledged there is not enough time before the November midterms to conclude any full renegotiation. Here is the mechanism that connects Beijing to Ottawa, and I want to be precise about this. Trump did not just make a decision about Taiwan arms sales this week. He demonstrated in a live press conference the governing framework under which he evaluates prior commitments, utility in the present moment, not obligation from the past. If that framework is applied consistently, and there is no reason to believe it will not be, then Canada's negotiating position at the CUSMA review on July 1st is operating under a fundamentally different set of assumptions than the ones Ottawa has been working from. The question is not whether Trump will honor CUSMA in its current form. The question is whether he will treat it as a floor or as a starting point for extraction. And I genuinely think Ottawa has not said this out loud yet. The official framing from the Carney government has been constructive engagement. That may be the right strategy. But the Beijing summit suggests the other side of that engagement is operating on a different theory of what commitments mean. Let me bring this down to where it actually lands. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed to normal commercial transit since the Iran war began in late February. 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that strait. Brent crude surged above $100 per barrel in late April and early May, according to Statista data tracking global fuel price changes. In Canada, the national average for regular gasoline sat at approximately $1.90 per liter in mid-May, according to CAA, up from $1.70 just 1 month prior. In Metro Vancouver, gas crossed $2 per liter. Patrick DeHaan, head of petroleum analysis at GasBuddy, told Global News that if the strait remains closed through parts of June, Canada could set new all-time records at the pump. Think about the transmission mechanism here, because this is the piece that Ottawa rarely explains. A decision made in Washington to engage militarily with Iran, for which no formal congressional authorization was sought, and for which Canada was not consulted, closed a waterway 10,000 kilometers from Manitoba. That closure tightened global oil supply. That tightening raised Brent crude above $100. That crude price increase hit Canadian refiners, who passed it to distributors, who passed it to the pump, where a person in Sudbury or Saskatoon or Surrey is now paying significantly more to fill their tank than they were in January. That person does not import oil from Iran. They do not trade with Iran. They have no relationship to the Strait of Hormuz whatsoever, except that they live in a globally integrated energy market. And the decision that set that chain in motion was made without them, without their government's input, and without any formal bilateral consultation mechanism that Canada could invoke. The regional divergence is worth noting. Alberta sits on 300 billion barrels of oil sands reserves. Alberta producers have actually seen a short-term price benefit from elevated global crude. Higher prices mean higher revenues on exported bitumen. But Alberta consumers are also paying more at the pump because retail gas prices in Canada are set by global benchmarks, not domestic production costs. In British Columbia, the impact has been most visible at the pump. In Quebec, where the economy is more dependent on manufacturing and transport, both of which run on diesel, which Statista data shows rising faster than gasoline globally, the cost pressure is felt differently. That regional divergence is itself a political variable for the Carney government, navigating a country where the economic experience of the Iran war looks different depending on which province you are standing in. And here is the image I keep coming back to. The same week that Canadians were reading about record gas prices, Donald Trump was asked aboard Air Force One about Iran's latest diplomatic proposal. He said, "If I do not like the first sentence, I just throw it away." He confirmed that his threshold for engaging with Iranian diplomatic documents was the first sentence. If sentence one is unacceptable, reading stops. Rex Brainin, a professor of political science at McGill University who specializes in the Middle East, told CBC Kids News that Iran is attempting to put economic pressure on the United States precisely because it cannot match U.S. military power directly. That economic pressure through the Strait is being distributed globally, including to Canada, including to the person paying $1.90 per liter in Ontario this weekend. The war, the diplomacy, and the gas price are the same story. They are just not usually told that way. So where does this leave us? Three scenarios, and I want to be honest that genuine uncertainty exists across all three. Scenario one, the Taiwan arms package goes forward within the next several weeks. Trump signs the $14 billion deal. Taipei gets the missile systems. Beijing responds with economic pressure, potentially including walking back the Boeing commitment, which remains unconfirmed. The summit is retroactively reframed as having failed to produce a durable accommodation on Taiwan. In this scenario, the U.S.-China relationship returns to a more adversarial posture. For Canada, this is actually a more familiar operating environment, one where the alliances and commitments are clearer, even if the tensions are higher. Scenario two, the arms package is quietly shelved or dramatically reduced. Trump cites the need to avoid a war 9,500 miles away. The Boeing deal is confirmed. A board of trade mechanism, which CSIS analysts described as a managed trade framework using quotas and export restraints, becomes the operating model for U.S.-China commerce. In this scenario, Taipei's security environment deteriorates, and the precedent that prior U.S. commitments to democratic allies are negotiable becomes harder to argue against. For Canada going into the CUSMA review, this is the more unsettling scenario because it confirms the governing logic that July 1st now operates under. Scenario three, and this is the one CSIS and some foreign policy analysts consider underweighted, is that neither scenario one nor two fully captures what happened. That the summit genuinely produced a modest stabilization, that the Taiwan arms question will be resolved through quiet diplomacy rather than public confrontation, that the Boeing deal gets confirmed in the coming weeks, and that the June-July period produces enough diplomatic movement on Iran to ease the Strait situation and bring global energy prices down. That is not impossible. It is just not what the Air Force One press conference suggested. The next signal to watch is not the arms sale announcement, though that will come and it will matter. The first signal is whether the Boeing deal gets formally confirmed by Boeing and the Chinese government in the next 2 to 3 weeks. A deal that remains unconfirmed after a month is a different thing than a deal that closes. The second signal is the CUSMA review mechanics in the weeks before July 1st, specifically whether Washington signals it wants bilateral talks with Canada separate from Mexico, which multiple analysts, including former negotiators, have flagged as a strategy to weaken Canadian leverage. The question I keep returning to, and I genuinely do not think Ottawa has answered it, is this. Canada has built its trade and security posture on the assumption that bilateral commitments with Washington are durable across administrations. Beijing just produced a data point suggesting they are not. What does Canadian foreign policy look like if that assumption has to be rebuilt from scratch. What's your read on how this plays out? Let me know in the comments. Trump's decision on the $14 billion Taiwan arms package is expected, in his own words, within a fairly short period. When it lands, it will either reassert that U.S. security commitments to democratic allies are not subject to renegotiation with the party they were designed to deter, or it will confirm that the governing logic articulated on Air Force One on the 15th of May applies more broadly than Taiwan. For Canada, with a CUSMA review on July 1st and a gas price crisis that traces directly to American foreign policy, the distinction is not abstract. Coverage the moment the decision drops.